Morning, everyone. We are in Harah, chapter 5, Mishna Beis, Mishna 2. Okay, so the previous Mishnah dealt with a law that if you uprooted certain young plants and replanted them again, there would be no obligation to have to separate Trimus and Maasros before you replant them, even though one is not permitted to plant Tevel, because their processing hasn't been completed, and therefore they're not set to the Maasros obligation yet, and therefore you can still plant them. Now the Mishnah says the following case. Somebody who uproots, lefes is turnip, tznoinus, or radishes, from his own property, and he replants it in a different place in his property for the purposes of producing seeds. Now, that means like this, that they would take fully grown turnips or fully grown radishes and replant them. And when they replant them, the radishes and the turnips would become hard and edible. But this was the way to produce seeds for turnips and for radishes. So when you uproot that edible turnip or radish with the intention of replanting it again for it to produce seeds, chayiv, then you're obligated to separate Trimus and Maasros before you can replant it. Because by uprooting it, you have now made their goren. You have now made their, this is their completion. Their processing has been completed. When you go ahead and use this turnip for that purpose, there will be no more processing done to this presently edible turnip or radish. Now, your intention is to replant it, and when you replant it, it's the radish and the turnip are going to become inedible. The seeds will be inedible. So there's no continuity of this edible produce. And since there is no continuity of edible produce, this edible produce is already completed once you uproot it. Typically, when it comes to these things, it's not enough just to uproot it to be considered processing is done, let's say, regarding to snacking. We've had previous Mishnahs that say that by some of these things, you would put them in a basket first before they're completely processed. But here, there's not going to be any putting into a basket. The next step is to replant it. So at this point, where the produce is in this edible state, it is considered processed. Since it's processed, it's tevel. It's set to the Maasros obligation. It's tevel. You can't replant it until you separate the Trimus and the Maasros. Now, so that's the case where, that's this case. That's the end of that case. That when you uproot the turnips and the radishes for the purpose of replanting them to produce seeds, you may not replant them until you separate Trimus and Maasros. Okay, now we have the next case, and that is Bitzalim, onions. Misheshrishu ba'aliyah, when they take root in the attic, tarim alatame, they become pure from becoming impure. So that means like this, you were storing these onions in the attic on a dirt floor. And these onions took root into the floor. It seems to be common. This is common by onions because maybe that's the way you store onions in those days. It could be anything. But the example of the Mishnah is onions. So you put, so you put the onions on the dirt floor and they took root. So now the question is, once they took root, are they considered attached to the ground? Being attached to the dirt of a house, which is part of the house, and the house sits on the ground, it's considered attached to the ground. And therefore, that would be that way. The thing is that in this case, number one, there was no intention for them to take root. And number two, it's not the usual way how onions are planted to grow. Maybe in this unusual state, or because it's unintentional, it shouldn't be considered like it's connected to the ground. So the Mishnah says when the onions take root in the attic, they are tar from becoming tameh. That means they're no more susceptible to tumah. When something is attached to the ground, that's susceptible to tumah. If let's say you had a plant that became tameh and then you replanted it in the ground, it would become like new, and the tumah would actually go off. So the Mishnah here is saying that these onions that took of the attic, they become pure from impurity. They will not be susceptible to tumah anymore, or if they were tameh, the tumah would go off. That's because even though it was unintentional, that it should take root, that doesn't matter for this law of tumah, regarding purity and impurity. And although it's an unusual way that it's growing, here too, when it comes to the laws of tumah, it's considered attached to the ground. We find that when it comes to this idea of things attached to the ground not being tameh, we find, as the Bartanura says, that the Torah seems to be more lenient there. And therefore, number one, the fact that they were unintentional, there is a verse in the Torah that it's derived, unintentional in this situation won't make a difference. Neither will it make a difference the fact that it's unusual the way that it's growing. Okay, and therefore it's tar from tumah. But from the fact that the Mishnah says it's only tar from the laws of tumah, that implies regarding other laws of being connected to the ground, it will not apply. And what that means is the following. That means that this, again, these onions on the dirt floor in the attic that took root, they are not considered connected to the ground for the laws of Meiser, meaning, let's say, new onions grew. They attached to the ground and new onions grew. So did these onions grow from the ground or not? The only produce that is obligated to separate Shemus and Meisers from are something that grows from the ground. If it doesn't grow from the ground, there's no obligation. So when it comes to the laws of Meiser, meaning if new onions were to grow, what would be their status? Would they be considered grown from the ground or not? The answer is they would not be considered grown from the ground. Being that they're growing in a very unusual manner, that's not called growing from the ground. That's not called, it has to be a regular manner that's growing from the ground to be considered that it's halachically connected to the ground and taking on the status of that. Here, where it's unusual the way it's growing, it won't make a difference for Meisris in the sense that Meiser, the new onions that grow, will not have any obligation to Meiser whatsoever because they're not considered growing from the ground. And the same thing, any of these new onions, let's say with Shemitah, and it grew from the ground during the Shemitah year, would be considered Shemitah produce because it's not growing from the ground. Okay, so that's in the case where you were storing them on the floor of the attic and they took root. Now we have a different case. You had these onions, let's say in the attic. The house collapsed. So you've got debris, you've got ground, you've got stuff all over, covering over now the onions. Their leaves are sticking out from the debris in the dirt. Now we say, now the onions are considered like they're actually growing in a field. Now they are considered actually growing from the ground. That's because this is the usual manner for onions to grow. The roots and the bulb itself, the onion itself, is covered by the ground and the leaves stick out. Well, that's what's happening here. That wasn't the original plan, but that's how it's turning out. Basically, you've got the ground and other things too, but you have the ground that's covering the onion as it typically does. The leaves are sticking out like they typically do. And even though they are sticking out, that's how they typically do. And therefore, it's like planted in the field itself. And therefore, if new onions grow, it's considered they grew from the ground, will be obligated in Meiser. And if it was the Shemitah year, they'd be considered Shemitah produce. Yesterday we began, the Chavetz Chaim was enumerating the different curses that the Torah talks about, a curse on a person who does certain things. And the Chavetz Chaim showed how two of them that we learned through yesterday can apply to someone speaking Lashon Harah. Now, the third one is the following. Let's say Lashon Harah by a person is ownerless, meaning he doesn't care. He couldn't care less. You know, there's some people, they speak Lashon Harah, they catch themselves and they say, oh yeah, I spoke Lashon Harah. Some people, it's just part of their way they talk. He doesn't in any way take upon himself to prevent himself from doing it. He now transgresses a third curse. Cursed by the person who does not uphold the Torah to do it, to do them, meaning to do the mitzvahs. What does that mean? He doesn't uphold the Torah to do them. This refers to a person who does not accept upon himself to fulfill the entire Torah. He is called a mummer for one thing. A mummer is a person who abandons the Torah. Now, you can have a person who says, I will keep 612 mitzvahs, but the 613th, whatever he chooses it to be, I'm not doing that. So he accepts everything but one. You are now a mummer. Mummer means you're out of the fold for one thing. I'm sorry. So therefore, in general, if you just decide to abandon one mitzvah, you fall into what's called a mummer, which means a person who is, he'd be the equivalent of an apostate. He is an apostate, rather, because he's intentionally not taking. Now, the person who couldn't care less about speaking Lashon Harah is the same idea. You may not ask him it straight out. He may not be saying, I don't accept Lashon Harah as a mitzvah. If you ask him that, of course he said, oh, of course I do. But the point is, practically speaking, his actions show that he couldn't care less. So that means, practically speaking, he is just abandoning a mitzvah. Like any other time, who's a person who's a mummer who abandons the entire Torah. Because we know a person is a mummer, whether you abandon the entire Torah, you just abandon one mitzvah. It's not like, he keeps 612. All right, so he doesn't do the 613th. If you don't accept all 613, that means you're accepting the complete Torah. You're not expecting the word of God. There's a word of God that you're just abandoning. That makes you a mummer. That, says the Chavetz Chaim, even if you act that way, that you couldn't care less, that it doesn't, that you're basically abandoning it through the way you show that you couldn't care less about the mitzvah. It's the same idea. And therefore, he would be included in this curse. So we have enumerated three curses that can possibly come upon a person through this bad trait of speaking Lashon Harah. Now he adds in parentheses, let's say he spoke Lashon about your father and mother. Then you transgress a fourth curse. Which is the curse on a person who belittles his father and mother. You do remember Hagemara of Shavuos? The Talmud in Tractate Shavuos states, the Urur, what does Urur mean? By klala by nidai, there's a curse and excommunication, which means that a person, if he comes into excommunication by heaven, his prayers aren't listened to. A person who knows about himself, that he has not been careful at all when it comes to this very bitter sin, he has to be concerned that perhaps he has been put into excommunication for this. There are other very bad things that come about because of this terrible sin of speaking Lashon Harah. It can bring about, see, until now, it's transgressing prohibitions, transgressing curses, transgressing what the Torah says is a wrong thing to do. But then there are qualities that the Torah doesn't outright forbid, but we know that they are terrible qualities because they basically undo what a person is meant to be. So a person becomes cruel. A person who speaks Lashon Harah habitually can become a very cruel person. Or there's the trait of anger. Speaking Lashon Harah can bring you to anger. We know that we know from the Talmud talks about when a person has a bad temper. You can come to mockery. There's a very bad trait called leitzanis. Mockery. Person who is an habitual mocker of things. You speak Lashon Harah and you keep speaking badly about people, that could lead a person to mock others. And to many other bad qualities. Al Kain, therefore. Basically, now at the end of this introduction, going through the possible prohibitions, negative commandments and positive commandments and curses, and talking about the bad qualities you can develop. We know now how, with all this alone should let us know how terrible it is to speak Lashon Hara. The Torah gave us an explicit prohibition. Because of Allah, lav miyuchad, and it gave us a specific prohibition about it all. And that is, don't go around being a talebearer, which means don't go around speaking Lashon Hara rechilas. And the Torah did this more than any other bad trait. The Chofetz Chaim is pointing out that it's very interesting that there are other bad traits that we know are considered very bad. The Talmud talks about it, the Midrashim talk about it. We know they're very bad traits and they can lead to very bad things, but there's no explicit prohibition. The Torah doesn't have a prohibition, don't get angry. The Torah doesn't do that, it doesn't have that. But the Torah does say, don't speak Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is, in essence, a quality. It's a bad trait, it's a bad character trait. It's a bad character trait like anger. But still, although other traits, the Torah does not give an explicit prohibition to it, here it does by Lashon Hara. So besides the fact that we know all the potential sins that can be transgressed, think about the fact that as a bad characteristic goes, a bad quality goes, Lashon Hara is the only characteristic, bad trait that the Torah gives a specific, explicit prohibition about, which should make us be aware of how severe the sin of speaking Lashon Hara is. Have a wonderful day.